Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm your host, Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is Ry Moran, the director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Ry previously served as a director of statement gathering with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and Ry is also a distinguished musician. Ry, thanks so much for being here with us this week.
Thanks for having me on.
I'd like to start with those radio ads that we were hearing so much about recently that were running in Saskatchewan, the ones describing the so-called, quote, myths about residential schools. And just what did you make of those ads, given that we're supposed to be in this era of reconciliation?
Yeah, well, I think when we heard about those ads coming out, we were very disappointed. I would have to say that I wasn't shocked, though, that such ads were coming out. You know, there has been a fairly strong countercurrent to the overall process of truth and reconciliation in the country. You know, we've seen people like Senator Lynn Biak and other certain members of Canadian society resisting the notion that the residential schools themselves were bad. Mm-hmm. And I think what Canadians really need to understand is that this was a bad system with occasional rays of light. You know, it's not that there weren't good teachers in it, it's not that there weren't positive experiences that students had, but the overall system was deeply damaging, deeply affecting. I think the other big problem with the myths that we saw presented is that their own research was actually quite shoddy, to tell you the truth. It didn't even rely on some of the very well-established facts around the residential schools. So they got the number of years of attendance. They really missed the mark on intergenerational trauma. And these things are well-established, well understood. There's a lot of research that backs this up. So it's hard to even call it research, to tell you the truth.
And despite, you know, what you say is wrong with their research and everything else that's known, I read that you weren't surprised that ads like this ran.
No, we're not surprised because, you know, racism is alive and well in this country. There's you know, that needs to be acknowledged. The idea that Indigenous peoples are still being given favors by this country is also a very powerful narrative. Mm-hmm. And those types of things sit underneath this report that has been issued by the Frontier Policy Centre. You know, this idea that really the residential schools were intended to help Indigenous peoples. Well, that was not the case. Mm-hmm. The explicit intent of the policy was to forcibly assimilate, forcibly convert First Nations, Inuit, Métis people into something that they were not. So we're not surprised, we are disappointed, and I think what is important to recognize is the very reason why we have a National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation today in this country is specifically to combat these types of reports. People that drafted the settlement agreement recognized that this type of issue was going to come up over and over and over again. And even in 2018, I mean, if we look at other international contexts, there's still people that are denying the fact that the Holocaust happened. Right. You know, we're going to have to keep doing that in this country as well for a very long period of time, and that's just the sad reality of repairing this broken relationship.
The ads were pulled. The text that was on Frontier's website disappeared. The host or the announcer who voiced them apologized, said he didn't somehow know that what was on there was not true. Mm-hmm. But had the damage been done already?
Well, I think it's hard to say what the actual effect of this work is going to be on the country. I think the concern when we see mistruths like this communicated is that, you know, people will glom onto this and will use this to justify their perceptions, oftentimes racist perceptions towards Indigenous peoples. So things like this do linger. And I think our obligation, certainly within the community, organizations like ours, and the broader coalition of allies that we have across the country, is to keep speaking the truth. You know, keep telling the stories, tell it in every medium possible, and really help Canadians understand that this process of truth and reconciliation is very much in the national interest. This is about building a better country for everybody.
What we are speaking of these ads is just, you know, one example, and we'll get into some others later. But 3 years after the release of the TRC calls to action, how would you characterize reconciliation right now in Canada?
Well, I think, you know, the state of reconciliation, I think we have to remember we're still in the infancy, really, of this overall process. You know, we can go back to when the apology was issued by the Prime Minister. You know, that was in response to litigation that started to bring forward the very serious claims of sexual and physical abuse that happened in the schools. We really have only been talking substantively on a national basis about residential schools for about 20 years, you know. And I can look back on where we started from with the Commission in, say, 2009, 2010, and it's very easy to see a marked difference in where we are today. The level of discourse, the level of awareness is increasing. It is permeating and penetrating schools across the country. But that's not to say we don't have a long ways to go. And fully realizing things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, fully realizing many of the more complicated calls to action, you know, we've got a lot of work to do on those still.
The Liberal government promised to implement all of the TRC recommendations that fall under federal authority. How's that going?
You know, I think there are a number that are in action. You know, there's a lot of starts. I think we have to see how this translates into substantive change, because I think we have to remember that reconciliation is fundamentally about changing the status quo. So the one big one that I think a number of us are very concerned about is the status of the National Council on Reconciliation. And it falls right in the middle of the TRC's calls to action, kind of in the mid-50s. And there have been efforts to date on that National Council. The Prime Minister committed to creating it. There was the interim board that was created. There was a report that was tabled to Minister Bennett. But that council has to be created, because that is truly the mechanism that is going to really assess the full implementation of these calls to action. And it needs to be protected, it needs to be properly funded, and it really needs some appropriate teeth. And you know, there's ones like that. There's the Royal Proclamation that was called for in the TRC's calls to action, where you know there's efforts underway, but we are heading into an election cycle. I think the question is what will this Liberal government get done before the election happens? And some of these big ticket items are absolutely necessary to anchor sooner rather than later.
And you talk about those promises, and there have been promises to move on child welfare and bring in legislation, and legislation on the Languages Act, and big promises here, but no action yet. Are you hopeful that, as you mentioned, we're heading into an election pretty shortly? Are you hopeful that some of these promises will be enacted?
Well, I think, you know, it does take time to achieve things, legislation and legislative drafting. There is a timeline associated with that. But the countdown is on to the election. I mean, we've got basically 10 months before we're going to see, you know, the election actually, you know, kick into the actual function of the election.
Right.
So we've got 10 months, and I think between here and then we're going to have to see what can be accomplished. And I think, you know, I remain hopeful that the work undertaken on some of these big ticket items, like the Languages Act, like the National Council on Reconciliation, will be completed. But, you know, time is ticking. Time is ticking. Yeah.
Our time is ticking as well here, and so we'll take a short break, but we'll be back to continue our conversation with Ry Moran here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Ry Moran, the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And Ry, one of the concerns that's come up recently was, you know, the potential destruction of the records that were, you know, collected, I guess, during testimony. And where are things at with that?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. I mean, this relates to the records that were generated by the independent assessment process. And I think for the benefit of the viewers, it's important to understand the status of where things rest right now. You know, the case on what should happen to those records did go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. It was heard last year in March. A decision was rendered in the fall of last year. That decision upheld the requirement for a notice program to be created to inform survivors of their rights to preserve their documents at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. The courts also confirmed, though, that the independent assessment process, chief adjudicator or secretariat, would be responsible for administering that notice program. So the chief adjudicator is working on rolling that notice program out. You know, that's going to inform some survivors of their rights to deposit their materials at the NCTR. Certainly we hope that the notice program is going to be robust and will provide survivors with the information that they need, and then that they can make the choice that's best for them.
And you, like you mentioned, what's best for them. You can appreciate that some people would maybe want their records destroyed and not out there, but what is there to be lost here as well with this?
Well, it's been such a complicated case how it's materialized, and you know, as the discussions were ensuing in court, there were a lot of very rightful concerns expressed over the personal information in these records. You know, this is highly sensitive information. This is oftentimes represents the worst moments of people's lives. So the question wasn't just what to do with the records, but what to do with that personal information in there. The reality is, what has happened, you know, for better or worse, is that the record itself will be destroyed. You know, the overall integrity of the record. So while we once had a full record of the full extent of the serious sexual and physical abuse that occurred in the residential schools, we have lost that. Because, you know, people that have passed away, people that don't opt in, won't have the ability to preserve their material.
Right.
So I guess the idea is that we will end up with people opting in, that there will be a certain portion of survivors that opt in, but that overall integrity will be lost, and frankly it will be lost forever in this country's history. Now, is that good for reconciliation? Is that good for truth-telling? There were different perspectives that were submitted in the courts. Certain groups said that getting rid of this terrible history was actually necessary for reconciliation. That's not the position that the National Centre took. The National Centre took more of a position that said, actually, we need this information. We need to, again, hold this country to account in terms of what it has inflicted upon survivors because of things like the Frontier Policy Centre that want to keep diminishing the level of harms. But in that, you know, the personal information obviously has to be protected, and there's absolutely no question that survivors deserve to be treated respectfully, fairly, honestly, in all of these processes. These have to be survivor-driven decisions that we're making as a country.
Right, I'd like to move to reconciliation, and one example we've been seeing is the renaming of public buildings, renaming of streets, some of these statues that have been coming down. Is this reconciliation in action?
I think it's certainly part of the conversation, for sure. We have to think about how we are choosing to remember people, places, locations in this country. And this is, Canada is not the only country grappling with this. This is an issue world over, as many countries attempt to decolonize or re-understand their histories. So I think the process that we're going through in Canada is very, very healthy. I think these conversations need to be happening, and we absolutely need to be looking very critically at the actions of both our contemporary leaders, you know, and certainly our past leaders. I think, you know, in that too, we have to remember that we have just, as a country, we've created everything. So nothing is fixed in stone, literally, you know. So a street name, you know, it was not there and then it was there. And it doesn't mean that it can't change. And street names change all the time. So the question is, what are we trying to achieve as a country? And how are we trying to balance out our perspectives on what this country actually is? The reality is that this is an Indigenous territory. This is Indigenous land. There is absolutely no question about that. It's what we're trying to reconcile is the fact that Canada has kind of supplanted itself onto Indigenous space, and we need now to help Canadians understand the real truth of what this is, a country that has been inhabited by Indigenous people for millennia.
And we are seeing, that these moves are controversial, some of them, and some people are upset that, these statues are coming down. Is that maybe a good thing, though? Reconciliation isn't supposed to be all that easy at times, right?
Reconciliation is not easy. It's about changing the status quo. Anytime you're changing the status quo, it ruffles feathers. But I think the thing to remember is that nobody's talking about erasing history in all of this. It's about changing how we understand history. And history, for all of us, continues to evolve. We think about our own personal lives, understanding what our childhood was like. You have a different understanding of that when you're 20 versus when you're 30 versus when you're 40. Because you reflect on things more, you think about things more. Context becomes more clear. Perhaps as you watch your own children, you think, oh, well, that was interesting how my childhood was like. That's that continual reflection and revisiting of what it means to, be a recipient of all this stuff that's happened. I think, to me, what I think we should really be thinking about as a country is remembering also not just what the bad was, but also how the history has been presented. I kind of feel like it would be really effective for us to have museums of museums, right? Yeah. Or museums of some of these plaques that were and continue to be terrible misrepresentations of the true history of this country, or terribly biased history that actually fails Canadians in properly explaining to them what it means to live in this country.
You mentioned, thinking back on childhood, and on my own childhood, I grew up in a small town where a residential school existed up until 1949, but we never learned about it even in my own school. And are we seeing a change in the classroom where things are happening? We're learning more about this, because when I was growing up, we didn't.
Yeah, I think we are seeing changes in classrooms. It's not to say that there's not still a long ways to go, but generally speaking, across the country, most, if not all, jurisdictions in the country have certainly brought in residential schools information into the classroom. Hasn't always been perfect. There's certainly controversy around it. We've seen the rollback of some of this programming in Ontario. That I think is a real disappointing matter that has happened. But what we're seeing, I think, right now, which is really positive, is that we're seeing educators heed the calls to action to bring this information into schools, and then we're seeing this incredible rise or resurgence of Indigenous authors and Indigenous writers, and really fantastic content that's being created by Indigenous peoples to help inform students in the classroom.
Which I wanted to talk about, because we recently had the Edmonton Public Schools put books by Governor General award-winning author David Alexander Robertson and Richard Van Camp's novels on basically a do not read list. What does that say?
Well, that says a bunch of things, and that's the imperfection of all this kind of stuff. And I think part of what that was talking about was, is this going to be triggering for students? Is this going to be trauma-inducing for students? And I think we do, at a general level, have to think about age appropriateness of materials. I think that's fair, that's reasonable. It's why you talk to your kid differently in grade 2 than you do in grade 10. But when you see really excellent Indigenous authors kind of being excluded, one does have to question, well, who is going to replace that content? Right. And reconciliation, or more accurately, truth-telling, is uncomfortable. And the fact of the matter is we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. We have to be kind of unsettled. We have to be shaken up. And it really has to be the voices of Indigenous peoples that are leading in these conversations. It has to be Indigenous peoples that are informing people of what it means to reconcile. Because if we're reconciling on somebody else's terms, we may find that the whole thing just kind of falls apart.
Ry, we're going to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue our conversation here on Face to Face with Ry Moran. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Ry Moran, the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And Ry, I was wanting to ask you, what role can the average person play in reconciliation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it sort of depends whether we're talking about an Indigenous person or a non-Indigenous person. I think for non-Indigenous peoples, the most critical thing that individuals can do is rectify the imbalance of historical understanding and really try to put oneself into the shoes of an Indigenous person for a little bit. You know, don't judge a person before you walk a mile in their shoes. So increase the level of understanding, increase the level of understanding of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Understand this as a fundamental and necessary human rights code that will help steer this country into a good direction. You know, that's absolutely critical. You know, I think for Indigenous peoples, it's a little bit different. I mean, I think really what has to happen is we have to collectively heal from the trauma that has been inflicted upon us. And we have to treat ourselves gently. We have to treat ourselves respectfully in that. We have to recognize that great wrongs have been committed on Indigenous peoples at the hands of this country. And while we have to kind of mourn that in a way, we also need to both advocate for, which is absolutely essential, and then conduct the healing work that's necessary and try to repair the relationships that have been damaged by virtue of all of this nastiness in the country.
Right, we are short on time, but I did want to touch on one of the TRC recommendations, number 80 on the calls to action. That's the national, to establish a statutory holiday, a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors and families. It looks as though this is something that will be happening. There's some debate, I guess, on when it should happen, whether it's maybe National Indigenous Day or Orange Shirt Day. Do you have a preference? Are you hearing anything, or does it matter? Does it just matter that there is a day?
Well, I think what's important to recognize is there's multiple options, you know, and there are many days that are possible. So Orange Shirt Day for sure, National Indigenous Day for sure, those are options. But there's other days that have happened, you know. What about potentially the date that the TRC's final report was launched, or the conclusion of the TRC, or there was a day back before all of this work started called the National Day of Healing and Reconciliation, June 11th, I believe. There's also, you know, the whole discussion around what happened around, you know, Channy Wenjack and the date of his death, and when, you know, the country really heard the call to action around remembering the children that ran away from the schools. That's October 22nd. You know. So there's multiple dates. And I think we have to think about what the date is trying to achieve, you know, and what are we collectively trying to achieve. It's like what the elders say, what's the intention behind this? And I think what I see as being very important is when we look at the overall calls to action, there's calls to action for national monuments. There's calls to action for provincial monuments. There's calls to action for markers at every residential school. So I see something where Canadians are called upon, you know, to either put their tobacco down or put their wreaths, whatever they feel appropriate, to honor these residential school students. I think that it has to be at the right time of year, and I think we just need to make the decision.
Ry, we do have to leave it there, unfortunately, but really appreciate you coming on the show and speaking with us this week. This show and past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptn.ca/face-to-face. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night.